There's something that happens when you get used to performing at a certain level for long enough. You stop noticing what it's costing you internally, because on the outside, everything still works. Things get done, problems get solved, life continues to move forward. So it's very easy to assume that means everything is fine. But what isn't always obvious is what your system is doing underneath all of that. Because you don't actually switch off in the way you think you do. You just change the environment you're operating in. So you might step away from work, you might be at home, you might be technically resting, but internally the system hasn't really changed states. It's still doing the same thing it was doing before, just without the external input. And that's where this becomes interesting, because most people associate exhaustion with their workload, with hours, with pressure. But that's not actually the full picture. There are people who are objectively overworked and relatively calm internally. And then there are people who are not particularly overworked at all, and yet they still can't switch off. So something else is clearly going on. And it usually has less to do with what you're doing and more to do with how your system has learned to stay organized. Let me explain that a little more clearly. When you've operated in a high performance environment for a long time, your system starts to adapt to that environment. It learns that staying mentally active is useful, that staying slightly ahead of things prevents problems. Maybe that being switched on keeps things stable. And over time, that becomes the default. Not something you choose, just something that runs automatically in the background. So even when there's nothing urgent happening, internally, the system doesn't fully stand down. It just shifts into a lower intensity version of the same state. You might recognize this in yourself in certain situations, like when you sit down in the evening and instead of actually arriving in the moment, your mind starts moving through things from the day. Not always problems and not always stress, just moments and thinking ahead, maybe replaying, planning. And it doesn't feel dramatic enough to call it anxiety, but it also doesn't feel like full rest. And that in-between state is where a lot of high-functioning people end up living all the time. Not in crisis, not in collapse, but in constant parallel engagement. Now, the important part here is that this doesn't feel like a problem at first, because it comes with benefits. You're responsive, you're capable, you're reliable under pressure. You're probably the person who doesn't miss things. The person who stays on top of everything, the person who can handle a lot without visibly struggling. And for a long time, that identity felt like strength. But there's a quiet trade-off happening underneath that, because the more your system learns to stay in that state, the less contrast there is between on and off. So even rest starts to feel slightly active. Even downtime has a layer of management to it. And you might not notice it directly, but you feel it indirectly. In the sense that you never fully drop into anything. You're always slightly observing it at the same time. Even experiences that are meant to be enjoyable can feel like they're happening at a slight distance for you. And over time that creates a very subtle form of fatigue. Not because you're doing too much, but because you're never fully out of doing mode. Now, this is where it becomes a bit counterintuitive, because the obvious assumption is that the solution is to do less, or to rest more, or create more space. But if the underlying system hasn't changed, none of that will fully land. You can take time off and still feel internally active. You can reduce workload but still feel mentally engaged. Because the issue isn't the external load, it's the internal operating state. And that operating state has usually been built over years, through repetition, through reinforcement, through necessity. It's not random, it's learned. And more importantly, it's been useful for you. Because this is the part that often gets missed. The same system that keeps you slightly switched on at all times is also the system that helped you get here. It's what allowed you to stay consistent when things were uncertain, to think ahead when others just weren't, to hold responsibility without dropping things. So it isn't something that's wrong with you. It's something that's over-adapted. It's doing a job that used to be essential in a context where it isn't always required anymore. And that mismatch is where the tension comes from, because your life has changed, but your system hasn't fully updated its definition of what's necessary. So it continues behaving as if it still needs to hold everything in the same way as it used to, even when logically you know you don't. And this is why switching off doesn't respond well to effort, because you can't force a system to relax that still believes it needs to stay alert. You can't override it through logic. You can't negotiate with it through awareness alone, because it isn't operating at the level of thought. It's operating at the level of pattern. And patterns don't change because you understand them. They change when the system has repeated evidence that a different state is safe. Now, I want to be very precise here. This isn't about becoming less capable or less driven or less effective. It's about recognizing what part of you is still operating out of necessity versus what is actually required of you now. Because if you don't separate those two things, they stay fused together. And the rest always feels slightly incomplete, even when nothing is wrong, even when everything is technically fine. And this is usually the point where people start to realize something has shifted in them, not externally, but internally. Because the question stops being, how do I get more time off? And it becomes something closer to, why does my system not fully stand down even when I do? And that's a very different question. Because that question doesn't lead to optimization. It leads to reorganization of how your system has learned to operate in the first place. And that's what we're actually dealing with here. Not a lack of rest, but an inability to fully exit activation. Now, in the next video, I want to go into something even more specific, which is how this same pattern doesn't just affect rest, but starts to shape your identity itself, so that even when life improves externally, internally, you still feel like you're in the same mode you were before. And that's where things really start to get interesting. If you want a more detailed breakdown of how this pattern actually forms in the nervous system and how to begin shifting it properly, click the link underneath this video. That's where I go deeper into this and explain how to work with the system directly rather than trying to force it to change.